series. When you want to get a ticket, you have to call Paula Balgley.
Okay.
Not Bagley, Balgley.
Okay, how are you?
Okay. I was born in 1929. I'm now 88 years old, in case you didn't know this. And I was born in the Bronx in an apartment house. And we lived on, presently it's called Martin Luther King Street. The name of the street was changed. We lived in the midst of a ghetto, of a black and white neighborhood, and we had many friends in the black neighborhood. We loved it. They loved us. We had wonderful times together. I can tell you interesting stories about the times we grew up. Anyhow, I went to public school, the same schools that Colin Powell went to. PS 39, PS 52, and I didn't go to Morris High School. I went to Stuyvesant, and then I went to City College. Those are the ways that Colin Powell went. He was a very nice guy. He has a beautiful daughter and a nice-looking wife. His daughter is stunning.
Did you go to school with Colin?
I don't hear you.
You did not go to school with Colin Powell?
No, he was a little younger than me.
He's younger.
But he played stickball with us. He hung around with us. PS 60 was the dividing line between the black and white neighborhood. And PS 60 was, in those days, there was no co-ed schools. There was girls' schools and boys' schools. I went to junior high school 52, which was a boys' school, and PS 60 was next door to us. And it was, at that time, they allowed children at an earlier age to attend kindergarten and the first grade, not kindergarten, they didn't have first grade, first grade. And then there were so many girls there that they decided to build a new school. So they destroyed the back of our wonderful schoolyard. So we had a white schoolyard and a black schoolyard over here. So the white guys played here and the black guys played there. And once in a while we would meet under circumstances. Matter of fact, I used to come home from school. There's an interesting story here. I never told this to too many people. When I was in the early grades, we used to play stickball. I was very anxious to be a good stickball player. So I used to take my mother's mop stick every afternoon. I came home from school and go into the schoolyard and play stickball against the wall. And I developed such a skill of being able to place the ball anywhere I wanted from this practice. And they were building the school in the meantime. And you could hear it being constructed in the background. And all of a sudden I heard, "Help! Help!" What was I, 9 years old, 10 years old? So I was a little nervous. I searched out where it was. And there was a hole in the ground. When they built schools in those days, they put steel rods in the cement. I don't know if you know about construction.
Still do.
But that's how they built them forever. And I looked in there's a black kid there, and he was playing in the hole. And he fell in, and he was impaled on these steel rods. I was alone in the schoolyard. So we lived right next door to the schoolyard. I ran in the house to pick up my older brother, Bill, and he came running out. He said, "We got to help the kid." So he jumps in the yard, he takes the kid off and meanwhile, one of the other kids calls my mother down, and my mother brings some bandages, and we got the kid out, and we off the impalement, and we bandaged him up. We sent him on his way around the corner. What else can we do? You didn't call the police for black kids and white kids those days. You start trouble. So we sent him home, and he was all bandaged up, and we gave him iodine and Mercuric, everything that he needed. 2 years later, the Detroit riots took place. I don't know if you ever heard of the Detroit riots. That was when the black kids in Detroit went berserk over a situation of their situation and developed a problem. So this was a follow through throughout the country. So black people throughout this country went around looking for fights with white people. So in our neighborhood, because we were the only white people there, the black kids came over to our school, and they started, and we were sitting around getting ready for a stickball game, and a whole bunch of them came over. They were going to kick the hell out of us. And one of the kids stepped forward, "Don't touch this guy. He was the one that saved my life." And they all thanked me, and they went on their way. And we didn't get beaten up. But they went around beating up everyone else. It's an interesting story.
Where did you live?
Where did you live?
Where did you live?
In the Bronx.
Oh, what part
We
of the
lived
Bronx?
on, presently it's called Martin Luther King Street. And we lived on 7th Avenue in those days. 908 7th Avenue. Anyhow, that's one part of the story. Then I went on. I went to Stuyvesant, and as a kid I got a job as a messenger at the American Optical Company, and I became interested in optics. And I decided to become an optician because you got to remember the depths of the Depression was around us. You have no conception of what we had no money. My father had died when I was 2 years old. My mother was on relief. My grandma was on old age pension. And between the two of them, we had enough money for food and rent. I had a job when I was 9 years old, pushing baby carriages into stores for 95 cents a week. And I gave the money to my mother. And so I went from PS 52 to Stuyvesant. I took the test for Stuyvesant, and I went to Stuyvesant. Meanwhile, my brother grew up, and he went in the Marine Corps, and he was in heavy combat. He was on Tinian, Guam, and Iwo Jima, and all of a sudden, he disappeared. My mother, who was very sensitive to these things, had a complete nervous breakdown. I went to the American Red Cross. I can afford a lot of things today. I'm very wealthy. I went to the Red Cross and I asked them to just tell me if my brother's alive. And I was there with my mother. She was crying and weeping. She had a nervous breakdown. And you know, the Red Cross was a bunch of schmucks. What can I tell you? They didn't handle it correctly. And we finally, my brother eventually, about 8 months later, we got a letter that was shipped all over the world, finally came to our house. But meanwhile, my mother had a nervous breakdown, and I couldn't go to Stuyvesant anymore. Because Stuyvesant had a special program, only day students or not afternoon students. And I had to go visit her in the hospital, take care of my grandma. And it was a terrible life for a child to be grown up under those circumstances. And I worked for 10 years for the American Optical Company, and I decided I'd become an optician, so I went to the New York Institute of Optics, and I went there for 3 years, and took the state boards, and became the top optician on the boards, because I had a big background in math, and I got a job working back to American Optical Company. I made a nice living. And then I met my wife, Paula, as you all know, and I was a salesman for the American Optical Company, and I was making a nice living. And my father-in-law came to me, he says, "You don't make enough money. Come work for me, and you'll make more money." He owned a printing plant, and I went to printing school, and from there I learned how the printing. In those days, we had liner types. I don't know if you know what that is. We had all kinds of special equipment. We had 4-color equipment. We had a pretty good shop, but we specialized in galleries. We did, for 40 years, we did the Winter Antique Show. We did all the shows on the West Side, and we were very, very successful. At least I was. I changed the picture. They were very politically oriented, but when I got there, I got commercial people. Then the war came, and I decided I'd go back to City College, and I went back to, I exercised my scholarship, and I went back to City College for 2 years, until finally I got fed up with they give you not a 3A rating. I don't know if you know what that is. None of you remember that much about selective service. But selective service gives you that rating, and you put off being drafted as long as you have that rating. But they re-up it, they check you out every frequently. And I got tired of being checked out so frequently, so I took my hat on and I joined the Army with them, and I became, the Army had several different ratings. They had RAs, regular Army, and USs, and when he went to, he was in the Marine Corps, he got another rating, which was part of the Navy. And because I was an optician, but I had worked 10 years as an optician, and they discovered this, and all of a sudden I became, they give you a special number in the service called MOS, Military Occupation Specialty. And I was the only one in that part of the world who was a trained optician and could fit eyeglasses and do anything, because I had worked 10 years in the business. They sent me to Korea. I got as far as California, when all of a sudden the 7th Army in Europe found out about my MOS, and they grabbed me from there and flew me to Europe. They put me in the optical shop. And that's my experiences in the military. Of course, there's a lot of stories there. Then he was stationed in Europe for 2 years during the Korean War. And then I came home, I met my wife Paula, that's an experience too. Someday I'll tell everybody that, how I met her and we got married. But her father thought I was a big salesman in the optical business. And he thought I could make a good salesman in the printing business, which I did, and I became very successful at it. And they grew the company, and I attended CCNY at night, and I graduated with a BA, and after about 15 years, I retired, and we bought in Palm Isles. That's a quick story of my life. Now, Lanny Levine was the one who coerced me or suggested I do this subject. He says it's a major subject as far as America is concerned. And does everyone hear me?
Yes.
As far as America is concerned, the subject is slavery. So I picked the subject of red slavery, white slavery, black slavery, and I threw in the conquistadors, if you've ever heard of them. And that's where I'm going to start today. So I'm going to do red slavery first, and we have more time, I'll do black slavery. And you're going to be amazed who built this country. And it wasn't your parents and our parents, it was the slaves. That's what you learn this about. Anyhow, the first person that's most important, guess who it was? Christopher Columbus. He's now hated in various parts of our country. His statues are desecrated, and people don't understand what a cruel person he was, and he committed genocide, in case you didn't know this, but he created the country. You have to understand who we were. We all came to this country looking, my grandma came here in 1883 with 2 children. She walked off the boat, there was no Ellis Island, and she hailed a horse and wagon or whatever it was, and she went to Avenue D, and she brought up five children. Every single male member of my family has served in the armed forces, from World War I on. And this is true. And I'm sure many other families have the same thing. So I will stop my Columbus. The first people he met, as he came across, by the way, he left the Azores. You've ever heard of the Azores? They're islands off the coast of Europe. And 6 weeks later, he arrived in Hispaniola. And who was there to greet him? The Arawaks. Have you ever heard of the Arawaks? They were an Indian tribe. Arawak men, women, and children were naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Have you ever heard of those three ships?
Yeah.
Those are the ships that the king and queen of Spain, Iberian Peninsula. If you want to come up here, madam, please come up. I went to a lot of work to get this information, so I don't need any. I've selected what I think was best for you guys. For your information, the women were the best swimmers. The women could swim faster, better, and had better control over their breath, and not their breast. And they could outdo the men in everything. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore carrying swords and speaking oddly Spanish, the Arabs ran to greet them, brought them food, water, and gifts. He wrote of this in his log. They brought parrots and balls of cotton. They were able to produce cotton from the ground, and they wove it and made clothing out of it, or cloth, and spears, and many other things which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawks' bells. Ding-ling. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were very generous people. Matter of fact, most Indians and most natives in Africa, same thing, were also very generous to the explorers. Little did they know. They were well built. This is the Red Indians. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They did not bear arms, did not know them. He showed them a sword, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears were made of sugarcane stalks. They would, and this is what he's quoted in the book. They would make fine servants, and you know what that meant? Slavery. And he says, with 50 men, I subjugate them all. And make them good, and what I do.
Watch your mic.
Hello? And make them do whatever we wanted. The Arawaks of the Bahama Islands or the West Indies were much like Indians on the mainland. European observers were to say again and again for their hospitality, their belief in sharing, that these traits did not stand out in Europe. Selfishness and greed was part of the European way of life. Dominated as it was by the religions of popes and the government of kings, the frenzy for money, the Western civilization, and its first messenger to the Americas and the New World was Christopher Columbus. He says, as soon as I arrived in the Indies, and that's why the Indians were called Indians, because he felt that he arrived in India. And subsequently, all the American natives were called Indians because of this mistake that he made. And he took some of the natives by force in order that we might learn and might give the information, whatever there is in these parts. Basically, he was looking for
Gold.
AU, as they say in chemistry, gold. The information that Columbus wanted most, where is the gold? He persuaded the king, when he went back to Spain, he persuaded the king and queen of Spain to finance an expedition to the land. The wealth he expected would be on the other side of the Atlantic, not realizing that he went on the Atlantic side, he'd have to go across America to the Pacific side, and India would be waiting there, not realizing that he had to cross the Pacific Ocean. But like other informed people, he knew the world was round. In case you didn't know this, there were a few people who were navigators and cartographers, and they knew the world was round. But no one believed them. How could you believe that we didn't fall off the ball? And he could sail west in order to get to the Far East, and that's what he intended to do. It's now 1492. Spain was recently unified. Now, in case you were unaware of this, there were no Western nations in the sense that we knew it. England was just starting to organize. It was because of its isolation. It organized faster than some of the other nations. France, of course, was organized by the, I forgot the name of the family. It's my fault, not yours. And they became one of the first countries to be organized. Germany was made up of many separate states. And it took almost 200 years before the Kaiser was able to control Germany into one state, from 1492.
Bismarck.
I beg your pardon?
Bismarck,
That's 300 years.
1880s.
1492 and 200 years is 1692. Arithmetic teach you that 4 and 2 is 6. I'm sorry for you, Erwin. And they were all excited over the fact that someone had come back from China. Who was that person?
Our Uncle Polo.
Right. And he came back with gold, special clothing, and all sorts of stories about the wealth of the Far East. And this is what all of them were anxious to get to. So guess what happened in the year 1255? I'm not testing your knowledge. The Turks conquered Constantinople and put up a firm no go any further. So Western Europe couldn't go to the east by land because the Turks prevented them. And so where did they have to go? West. And how did they go west? They sailed. The ocean was there. And of course, the learned people knew that the world was round, and they get there, they can go around the world and arrive in Asia. If you remember Kublai Khan and the Khans, within 100 years they had moved east and they had taken over Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and they got as far as Austria. I don't know if you know your European history.
Yes.
I don't think you care, so forget it. But that was Kublai Khan. So here we are. Spain was recently unified, one of the most modern national states. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand brought the states under their control by conquering each province. So finally they had this Aragon into one state. Like, Spain had tied itself to the Catholic religion, and as a result of that, they expelled all Jews, Jews, Hebrews. And as a result of that, the day that Columbus left for America, in case you didn't know this, that was the day that all the Jews were kicked out of Spain. Matter of fact, one of his, or two of his sailors were Jews, and one of them was a cartographer, but that didn't make any difference. He was the chief maven for that. That's the important one that did all the work.
Was Columbus Jewish?
Say again?
Columbus, was he Jewish?
Raise your hand.
Right here. Was Columbus Jewish?
As far as I know, no.
Okay,
Because he was very anxious to perpetuate Christianity.
okay.
And so you have to remember at that time, Columbus came from,
General.
right, he was Italian. And to this day, they brag that if it wasn't for him, there would be no United USA. And Columbus was a marvelous sailor. For many, many years, he worked as a sailor, and he became very adept handling ships. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand was after girls. You know, he was a Bill Clinton, and that was one of his shticks. One of those things that they went around chasing girls. And he met Isabella. She was a very pretty girl, and she was a princess in another province, and he courted her, and they married. And because of that relationship, they became king and queen of Spain. And the Iberian Peninsula, I don't know if you know, fully aware of the Iberian Peninsula, but it's like this. And a big piece of it is Portugal. Portugal happened to be very fortunate. They had very trained sailors, and they were sailing out of Portugal, which one half of Portugal faced the ocean. Well, in Spain, only a little bit down here, and the rest of it came through the Mediterranean. They had to go to Gibraltar, if you know your modern history. But the Portuguese went down there, and they decided not to go west, but they went south. And they went around, they went to Africa, and gradually went down Africa, and they got to the Cape of Good Hope, went through, and up the west side, and they went to India. This doesn't happen in one day, it happened in 100 years. And as a result of that, black slavery came. But that's my latest story. We're still in the Indians. And the American Indians, the Arawaks, because Constantinople was captured by the Turks, they couldn't go east, they went west. Spain decided to gamble on a long sail across the ocean. What were they looking for? Gold. Gold. G-O-L-D. In return for bringing back gold and spices, the royalty decided to incite Columbus by promising him he would get a title, Admiral of the Seas. That was Columbus's title. He was Admiral of the Seas. They were very magnanimous. They gave him 10% of the profits after they got their investments back.
After taxes? Is that after taxes or?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that. I didn't check into that. He became governorship. He was given governorship of the newfound lands and the fame that would go with it, Admiral of the Ocean Seas. He was a merchant clerk from the Italian city of Genoa, similar to Andrew Hamilton's job, but he was a little older. Andrew Hamilton was a merchant clerk in a shipping company.
Yeah, he was 16 years old.
He was younger than that. He hadn't been bar mitzvahed yet. Andrew Hamilton was Jewish.
He was not Jewish.
His father was Jewish.
Yeah.
His father was not Jewish. His
He was
father
adopted by a
Hamilton.
Jewish family.
His mother was named Levine.
She married she slept with a guy.
What do you think happens when you marry a Jewish man? You have to take over his religion.
Right.
Yeah, well,
And that's what she did.
she wasn't Jewish.
I read, I'll give you the book.
I have read the book.
I didn't bring it with me. I left it there. If you want to come up here and finish the story, Erwin, you're welcome.
You're finished. I'm through.
I'm trying to give you as much information
Too much.
as you can get out of this. And they gave him 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Columbus would never have made it to Asia. There was no Panama Canal, which was thousands of miles further away than he had calculated. Imagining a smaller world, he would have doomed by the great expanse of the Pacific Ocean. But he was lucky. 1/4 of the way there, he came upon an unknown, uncharted island that lay between Europe and Asia, so to speak. The Americas. It was early October 1492. And 33 days since he left the Azores, or the Canary Islands, off the Atlantic coast of Africa, they saw branches and sticks floating in the water. They had a deal on board the boat. That one who saw the first piece of land, they had a pool, P-O-O-L, on board the boat. And everyone invested in it. And the guy, or the person, there wasn't a women on board. The guy who saw the first land would be and announced that he would be the winner of the pool, which was an enormous amount of money for those days. The next morning, on October 12th, a sailor called Rodrigo, one of the guys one of the Jews kicked off the island, saw the early morning moon shining on white sands and cried out, "Land ho!" It was an island in the Bahamas on the Caribbean Sea. The first man to sight land was supposed to get a yearly pension of 10,000 gold meravels for life. But poor Rodrigo didn't realize who he was dealing with. Columbus says he had sighted the land the night before. And he had entered it in the log, and he got the reward. Never fooled with the captain of the ship. So approaching the land, they were met by the Arawak Indians, who swam out to greet them. The Arawaks lived in village communities and had developed agriculture of corn, yams, and cassava. They hadn't grown, and a little cotton they grew too, but it doesn't mention it. They could spin and weave. They had no horses or work animals. They had no iron, but they wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears. Now guess what? The sailors on the ship, when they saw this gold, if there's this much, there's got to be this much someplace else. And this was to have enormous consequences. It led Columbus to take some of them aboard the ship as prisoners, first slaves. Because he insisted that they guide him to the source of gold, he then sailed to what is now Cuba, because they guided him there. Then to Hispaniola, the island which today consists of Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. There are bits of visible gold in the rivers, and a gold mask presented to Columbus only whetted his appetite. It was given to him by a local Indian chief, led to wild visions of gold fields. This only whetted their appetite. The Santa Maria crashed, and so out of the timbers of the ship, he built a fort. The first European military base in the Western Hemisphere. And he called it Navidad. Yeah, he arrived in November 12th, so a month later it was Christmas. And Navidad means Christmas. And he left 39 crew members with instructions to find and store the gold. He took more Indian prisoners and put them aboard his 2 remaining ships. At one part of the island, he got into a fight with the Indians, who refused to trade for the many bows and arrows that he needed. They ran them through with swords, and they bled to death. Then the Nina and the Pinta set sail for the Azores and Aragon. In the books it says Spain. When the weather turned cold, the Indians began to die. Why? Because the Indians had no clothes. They wore nothing. They just barely covered their private parts, and the women too, with pieces of cloth. Everything else was exposed. And as they got closer and closer to Europe, it was February, March, it got colder and colder. When the weather turned cold, the Indian prisoners began to die. Columbus made a report to the court in Madrid, and he was a braggart and he was extravagant. He insisted he had reached Asia, but it was only Cuba. And it was an island off the coast of China, Hispaniola. His descriptions were part fact and part fiction. Hispaniola is a miracle when it describes the topography. This all comes from Columbus's book. He told them that he would go on his next voyage and bring back as much gold as you wanted, and as many slaves as you could ask. He was full of religious talk. Got to remember, Catholicism was a big part of his personality, and it was very, very prevalent in this part of the world. One of the people who perpetuated Columbus was pastors who followed him up in the next group of ships. And these people were literate, and they went into his log and they enlarged on it. He brought with him 17 ships on the next trip, 1,200 sailors. The aim was clear: slaves and gold. That's what they wanted. They went by island to island, taking Indians as captives. But as word spread of the Europeans' intent, they found more and more empty villages. On Haiti, they found that the Indians left behind at Fort Navidad had been killed in a battle with the Indians after they had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves, and sex and labor, which is common in that period of time. Now, from his base on Haiti, Columbus had expedition after expedition into the interior. Guess what they found? Nothing. No gold fields. He had to fill up the ships returning to Spain with some kind of dividend. Guess what he put on the ship? Slaves. Indians. They rounded up 1,500 Arawak men, women, and children, put them in pens guarded by Spaniards and women, by Spaniards and dogs. They picked the 500 best specimens to load on ships. Of the 500 men, only 250 arrived in Spain. The rest of them died on the way. The archdeacon of the town where they led reported that the slaves were naked as the day they were born. They showed no more embarrassment than animals. Columbus later wrote in the name of the Holy Trinity, Catholicism, go on sending all the slaves that can be sold. Too many of the slaves died in captivity. So Columbus, desperate to pay back dividends to those who invested, had to make good his promise to fill the ships with gold in the province of Haiti and other places. So they ordered all poor people, 14 years of age, older or older, to go into the rivers and get the specks of gold which were washed down from the mountains and bring them to him. And when they arrived, he would give them copper things to wear in their ears as jewelry. But they had been given an impossible task. The only gold around was bits of dust garnered from the streams. So the Indians fled. They were hunted down with dogs and killed. Trying to put together an army of resistance, the Arawaks faced Spaniards who had armor, muskets, swords, and horses. When the Spaniards took prisoners, they hanged them or burned them to death. Guess what the Arawaks did to punish the Spaniards? They committed mass suicide. And with cassava poison, infants were killed to save them from the Spaniards. In 2 years, through the murder, mutilation, or suicides of the 350,000 Indians on Haiti, half of them were dead. Would you call this genocide? Thank you. When it was clear that there was no gold left, the Indians were taken as slave labor on huge estates. And this went on, killing and grabbing them for slaves and sending them back to Spain. Hello?
Didn't a lot of the Indians die of diseases?
I don't understand you.
Didn't a lot of the Indians die of diseases that they were not immune to?
Many of them died from the diseases that the Spaniards brought from Europe.
Yeah, they were not immune to.
Syphilis was a big thing that they brought. And smallpox also was a big thing. The Indians lived a very clean life. And yeah, give you a good idea. The women in Indian society were treated so well as to startle the Spaniards. Columbus, in his book, describes sex relations, not sex relations. Marriage laws are non-existent. Men and women alike choose their mates and leave them as they please, without offense, jealousy, or anger. They multiply in great abundance. Pregnant women work to the last minute and give birth almost painlessly. And the next day, after they bathe in the river and are as clean and healthy as they were before giving birth. If they tired of their men, they gave themselves abortion with herbs that force stillbirths, covering their shameful parts with leaves or cotton cloth. Although on the whole, Indian men and women look upon total nakedness with as much casualness as we look upon a man's head on his hands. The Indians have no religion. They have no temples. They live in Welsh, and he describes how they live. Now we come to Pizarro and all the the rich part of what happened. Book 2. Well, they're still talking about book 1. After 6 or 8 months work in the mines, which was the time required of each group, a third of the men died. Death was so common and genocide so prevalent you can't believe it. That's what Columbus and his people did. Henry Kissinger wrote about this, and he says, history is the memory of states. That's a big quote that they put in here. A world restored, in which he proceeded to tell the history of 19th century Europe. And Europe was very greedy and very anxious to get G-O-L-D. They didn't want the slaves, but they took them and sold them and used them. Terrible. They haven't gone, the Portuguese haven't gone to Africa. The Portuguese and the English were the ones who brought back the black slaves. What Columbus did to the Arawaks, we just discovered, Cortez did to the Aztecs of Mexico. Pizarro to the Incas of Spain, of Peru, and English settlers of Virginia and Massachusetts to Powhatan and the Pequots and the Iroquois. And all these people were made, very few Indians in North America were made into slaves. This is I don't know why it happened. They avoided it, but by this time they preferred the black slaves, which the Portuguese were schlepping back from Africa. They made deals in Africa, going down the coast of Africa, all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope. And when going down there, they made deals by going inland, the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the English, which were the worst offenders at this time. According to my more than 3 books that I took care of, the English were the worst ones. And they built forts, and they pens, and they made deals with the local chiefs who kidnapped local black people from other tribes and put them in the pens, men, women, and children. And the British bought them from these chiefs and put them on ships and took them to the New World. But before they were taken to the New World, most of the blacks were brought and put in the West Indies because it was necessary after the first blacks came. First blacks came in 1619 in Jamestown, in case you never knew that. Jamestown was the first place that blacks came to America. It was like 100 blacks per year. And they spoke no English. They did not know anything. They also had no clothing, and they had their own way of life. And so when the Portuguese discovered that they'd get a better price for someone who could speak English, or understand some of the things that were being asked for them to do, they brought them to the West Indies, where they were trained to learn English. Of course, the English were up and down the east coast of North America, and they bought them. And when they came from the West Indies, they were very, very anxious to do well, the black slaves, because they thought they were going to be treated appropriately. Little did they know that a boss was put over them with a long slave whip, and to get them to work harder and faster, They beat them with whips, took their women, raped them. Mulattoes were born. And this is another, the blacks were divided into groups. Those who, yeah, they have a very, very strong way of treating you. I guess it was later. Meanwhile, we're still in South America. And what Columbus did to the Arawaks, Cortez did to the Aztecs. The Aztec civilization came out of the heritage of the Mayan Zapotec or Toltec cultures. It built enormous constructions from stone tools and human labor. The Aztecs also had slaves, but they got their slaves from other tribes. The cruelty of the Aztecs, however, did not erase a certain innocence, and when a Spanish armada appeared at Veracruz, Mexico, and a bearded white man came ashore with strange beasts, horses, clad in iron, they thought he was a legend of Aztec history. So they welcomed him with munificent hospitality. G-O-L-D. Hernando Cortez came from Spain with an expedition financed by merchants and landowners, blessed by the deputies of God. Who were the deputies of God? Priests. With one obsessive goal, to find gold. Gold. In the mind of Montezuma, who was the leader of the Aztecs, the king of the Aztecs had no certain about whether Cortez was a god from previous life. So he sent 100 runners to Cortez bearing enormous treasures of gold, a moon of silver, that's how big this hunk of silver was, a sun of gold, worth a fortune. And what did this only do? Made them greedier, because they knew now they found the source of gold. Then Cortez began his march of death. I don't know if you know your American history. Going from town to town, using deception, using Aztecs against Aztecs, killing with a kind of deliberation that accompanies a strategy to paralyze the will of the population. And so he invited the head of the various nations, when they came with thousands of unarmed retainers, Cortez, small army, posted around the camp with cannon. You have to understand, the Europeans were so cruel and so adept at treating these people that you cannot imagine how they killed thousands of them.
You had the Inquisition?
Say again?
I said the Inquisition.
That was 300 years later.
Inquisition, okay. Oh,
We're talking
okay.
in Peru, the conquistador Pizarro used the same tactics. The frenzy in the early capitalist states of Europe for gold, for slaves, for products of the soil, tobacco, cotton, and certain vegetables. To pay the bondholders and stockholders of the expedition, to finance the monarchical bureaucracies rising in Western Europe, to spur the growth of the new money economy. And that's what was happening in Europe. They were greedy for the money that was coming. To give you full understanding how much money was there, You all lived through 1936. What happened in 1936 to 1939 in Spain?
Revolution.
Spanish Revolution. So the Civil War, in the Civil War, this only comes out in history. You learn this. The communist side, which was Franco and his group, was supported by the, the
Loyalists.
Royalist side was supported by, Franco's side was supported by the Nazis. And they used modern equipment. But the other side, which was supported by the Soviet Union, they ran out of money. And so they couldn't buy ammo, they couldn't buy rifles. So where did they get the money?
United States. Donations.
They went into the history of Spain and they found the gold that was brought from Peru and Mexico, and they paid the Russians off with the gold from the New World. And that's how they got able to function and carry on the Civil War until the Nazis overcame them. Franco overcame them. That's true. They were using gold from the, yes?
I thought tobacco came from the New World.
Yes.
Where did that come into the picture? Was that in
The Indians, the tobacco was brought from Europe, and the Indians tobacco required a lot of love and care to make it. And you had to have someone plant them, take care of them, and grow. The tobacco became such an important, did you ever smoke?
No.
I smoked. And when you smoke, you need a cigarette. And I gave it up 55 years ago. But tobacco became very important. Yes, sir.
My aunt was married to a Spaniard. They lived in Lima, Peru, and he was descended from the conquistadors.
Peru,
Yes,
to your
Lima,
information,
Peru.
has the finest Spanish, purest Spanish language in the world today.
I have no idea.
Because it's one of the few places where the original Spanish language is still spoken. And this is not in the history books. I also met somebody from there, and he gave me a lesson on Spanish language. The Spanish language in Peru is the purest language in the world. Spanish.
It's the language of Castile, Castellano.
Oui, si. I speak
It's a
French.
language that
I
is
speak
taught
French.
in the schools here.
I speak French.
Let's,
I'm almost finished.
2
And I'm
minutes.
sorry we haven't finished and come to the black part. The black part is so interesting and so cruel by the British, by the English. They weren't Britain. The English were so cruel to the blacks, you cannot imagine. It makes what they did to the Arawaks look like pussycats. The black slaves suffered more than anything else. And there's a whole story about the black revolutions of black. Have you ever heard of Nat Turner?
Yeah, the revolt.
Harriet Tubman, and people like that who did everything they could possibly do to avoid slavery. You cannot believe if a guy, a black guy, didn't. I don't feel like doing it today. It hurts me here. The 39 lashes. There was a law that you couldn't hit a slave more than 39 times in a row. And age had no difference. They had stories of priests going into a house and seeing the overseer whipping a child 39 times, stopping at 38, 39, stopping, waiting a half hour, and proceeded to give him another 39. And then after they scarred him and beat them with all kinds, they would pour hot wax on or tar. It was just terrible, the things that they perpetrated against the slaves.
Okay, Howard, thank you very much.
when you run into a problem, I'll give you the second part. I may not be here then.